I trust you've had a chance to get oriented to the task ahead.
Yes, I also looked closely at the files you reviewed in your audit.
Well, why don't we go through the regulatory requirements related to IRB records one by one and see what my audit showed for each of these categories of records. And then you'll have a better idea of exactly what we need to focus on. First, as you know, the regulations state that an institution, or when appropriate an IRB, shall maintain adequate documentation of IRB activities, including the following: copies of all research proposals reviewed, scientific evaluations, if any, approved sample consent documents, progress reports submitted by investigators, and reports of injuries to subjects.
I believe in most instances these materials were included in the files you reviewed. But in the 2 studies that were supported by HHS through a grant to our institution, you found no evidence that the grant application was reviewed, which is a regulatory requirement. So we definitely need to keep track of those.
Yes. Now, moving right along, the second category of IRB records relates to the minutes of the IRB meeting, and I found several deficiencies here as well. Here, too, the regulations are quite clear. Minutes of IRB meetings shall be in sufficient detail to show attendance at the meetings. In reviewing minutes for IRB meetings, I found 2 instances where attendance of IRB members was not recorded.
I will implement a procedure to be sure we document which members, or their alternates, are present and which are absent, and document any consultants, visitors, or other guests in attendance, and also track members' arrivals and departures during the meeting.
I might also suggest that you document any IRB member that has a conflict of interest for a particular project and ensure they don't participate in the review of any project for which they have a conflicting interest, except, of course, to provide information requested by the IRB.
Yes, that is a standard practice for me.
Excellent. Okay. The next relates to the actions taken by the IRB. As you know, in addition to the other things we've been discussing, the regulations require that minutes of the IRB meeting must show actions taken by the IRB. Now, in my review of your minutes, it wasn't always clear to me which permitted action the IRB was taking, whether the IRB approved a study as submitted or whether they approved a study but required changes to it as a condition of approval.
And this is a good first topic for the IRB training session next week, pointing out that on initial as well as continuing review, they may take a range of actions. Approve the research, require modifications in order to secure approval, or disapprove the research. And then we'll make sure that the minutes reflect what motion is being made and how they voted.
The next item we should discuss is voting. And here, too, the regulations are clear. The minutes must show the IRB vote on all actions, including the number of members voting for a proposed action or motion, against, and abstaining. I think it's helpful to document the total number of members voting on each protocol, followed by the number voting for a particular motion or action, the number voting against it, and the number abstaining. And I was pleased to see that the minutes of the IRB meetings I reviewed appear to use this approach. They also seem to recognize the difference between an abstention and a recusal. I find many institutions record members with a conflict of interest as an abstention rather than a recusal. Of course, members who recuse themselves do not count towards the quorum and are not permitted to vote.
Yes, we both know that conflicted members are not allowed to participate in the initial or continuing review of any research for which they have a conflicting interest, except to answer questions posed by the IRB. That definitely won't happen under my watch.
Okay, so the next major area that the minutes need to cover is the basis for requiring changes in or disapproving research. The basis for requiring changes in or disapproving research must be included in the minutes. I found one instance where the IRB required the PI to make significant changes to the protocol. Among others, the PI was asked to increase the sample size and to change the inclusion-exclusion criteria, but there was no documentation about the basis for requiring those changes.
I'll make sure that in the future we include such documentation in the minutes of the meeting.
Okay, this brings us to the last element that must be included in the minutes, which is a written summary of the discussion of controverted issues and their resolution. Now, in my experience, this is something that a lot of institutions don't do well. I actually did find that in general, this information was included in the IRB meeting minutes of yours that I reviewed. So kudos for that.
Anytime there's significant disagreement or discourse among IRB members about anything of substance related to the protocol, I always document this in the minutes. And I also include a brief description of whether the differences were resolved by consensus prior to the vote or whether they were resolved through voting, allowing the majority in attendance to rule.
That seems appropriate. The next broad category of records that must be prepared and maintained is records of continuing review activities.
Well, our written procedures state which documents are required to be submitted for continuing review. It seems like all those documents become part of the project's IRB file. But I know you found one instance where copies of the protocol and an informed consent documents reviewed by the IRB did not reflect changes that were approved as amendments.
Well, one way to help tackle this issue is to update your IRB continuing review submission form to remind investigators that they need to submit documents that reflect any protocol and informed consent changes that were approved through amendments since the initial IRB review or the most recent IRB continuing review. And while you're at that, you should also include these operational details in your written procedures.
And also note that any amendments will need to be retained as part of the IRB records.
Yes, definitely. A good idea. Okay, the next category of required records includes copies of all correspondence between the IRB and the investigator. I wasn't sure whether all such correspondence was being maintained. The regulations require that certain communications between the IRB and investigator must be in writing.
Yes. I'm aware that the regulations at Section 46.109D require that an IRB notify investigators and the institution in writing of its decision to approve or disapprove the proposed research activity, or of modifications required to secure IRB approval of the research activity. But there's often additional correspondence between the investigator and the IRB, and all this communication will definitely be maintained.
Okay, moving right along. The next category of required records is a list of IRB members in the same detail as is described in Section 103B3. I believe a new IRB chairperson was recently appointed?
Yes. I reviewed the OHRP database and noticed that both the IRB registration and the FWA will need to be renewed within the next month. I'll update these with the change to the IRB chairperson and ensure that copies of these documents are retained.
I believe you'll also be given custody of the regulatorily required written IRB procedures. I believe you call them standard operating procedures, or SOPs here. This is the next category of records that must be maintained as part of the IRB records. I've been working with Dr. Westerberg and will work more with you to ensure that your written procedures are robust and compliant with the regulations at Section 103B. Now, I'm happy to say that we now come to the last category of IRB records that must be maintained, and this includes any statements of significant new findings developed during the course of the research, which may relate to subjects' willingness to continue participation that have been provided to subjects as required by the informed consent regulations at Section 116B5. Now, in my experience, many institutions overlook this requirement. The few times I've seen this, an investigator included the information in a progress report at continuing review.
Many times, such circumstances represent unanticipated problems involving risks to the subject.
Well, when this is the case, the investigator should report the significant new findings promptly to the IRB.
I agree. And these reports must become part of the IRB record.
Something else institutions often overlook as a record that must be maintained is the signed informed consent documents. The regulations at Section 115B specifically refer to records required by this policy, and informed consent documents fit that definition. Now, the good news is that during the audit, I learned from investigators that this institution does require them to be retained for a minimum of 3 years after completion of the study.
Related to that, I think we should develop a written procedure for what happens with these documents when an investigator leaves the institution. We may want to consider moving them to the IRB office once a study is closed.
Well, we can discuss this with Dr. Westerberg at our next meeting to find out whether the institution might want to weigh in. In addition, certain written correspondence between the IRB and the institution, the funding entity, and OHRP also constitute records required by the federal policy.
So, this might include written IRB communications notifying the institution of the IRB's determinations and actions, or the requirement to report certain incidents to the institution and the department or agency head or supporting institute and OHRP, right? We believe all such communications should be maintained as part of the IRB records. If we don't retain these documents, it's difficult to prove that we actually prepared and executed such communications.
I think it's helpful for the IRB to document certain other activities in the IRB minutes, or in the case of expedited review, in the IRB protocol file. For example, when the IRB alters or waives one or more elements of informed consent or waives the requirement to obtain consent under Section 116C or D, the regulations require the IRB to make certain findings and to document those findings. The regulations do not stipulate where this needs to be documented, but for convened IRB review, the documentation could be included in the minutes.
It might be helpful to develop a checklist for this and to ask reviewers to provide the rationale for why they find each criterion to be satisfied.
I agree. And I think this form could be used when review is conducted by the convened IRB as well as when expedited review procedures are used. The completed form could be added to the protocol file to provide the required documentation. And although the regulations do not require it, it may be a good idea to document somewhere that the IRB actually made all the determinations and findings the IRB is required to make when taking specific actions. I find that reviewer checklists help IRB members do their job more efficiently and help ensure that they consider all the criteria for approving research under Section 111 and any relevant subparts.
I actually brought copies of the forms that we used at Del Boca Vista University and can easily adapt them for use here.
Yes. Well, this could be very helpful. We've made good progress on tackling which records must be maintained and some that are recommended to be maintained. Now, on the issue of retention, I'm always surprised that some institutions are not aware of the retention requirements, but I was pleased to learn that this institution recognizes the retention requirements in its written IRB procedures. Now, as you are undoubtedly aware, all the records required by this policy have to be retained for a minimum of 3 years, and records related to research that is conducted must be retained for at least 3 years after completion of the research. So just to emphasize, this includes records relating to research that never actually begins, as well as, of course, research that occurs and then is closed out. For research that was never conducted, the 3-year clock begins on the day the last information was received by the IRB or the day the IRB took its last action, whichever is the most recent.
And this, of course, is the minimum retention period, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we also need to check into other federal, state, and local requirements that may be relevant to the research conducted here. And in addition, we should look at professional standards of practice.
Although the IRB chairperson assures me that they understand the requirement and do strive to meet the minimum records retention requirements, I did find a few lapses. Well, as I mentioned earlier, they were not able to locate some of the records I requested. This could pose a regulatory problem because the regulations do require that all records must be accessible for inspection and copying by authorized representatives of the department or agency at reasonable times and in a reasonable manner. So if they were maintained, they did not appear to be readily accessible.
With our new procedures, this concern should be addressed.
I agree. Well, this pretty much covers what we set out to do today. Look, I'm very pleased with the progress we've made to date, and I'm especially pleased that the institution was fortunate enough to recruit you at this time.
Oh, I'm delighted to have the opportunity and very much look forward to being able to make a contribution to improving this institution's human subject protections program.